All right, settle in, dim the lights, grab that comfy blanket. Tonight we're not just telling a story, we're stepping back in time, way, way back, to an era that felt a bit like a real-life video game, but with way more scurvy and no cheat codes. We're talking about the late 1500s. Imagine a time when maps still had "Here be dragons," and the world was suddenly, thrillingly, much, much bigger than anyone thought. This was England under the watchful and often very serious eye of Queen Elizabeth I. She was sharp, she was powerful, and she had a bit of a rivalry going on with her cousin, King Philip II of Spain. Think of them as two giant chess players on the world stage, constantly trying to outmaneuver each other. Spain was already doing pretty well, thank you very much, with vast empires in the Americas, pulling out tons of gold and silver. England? Well, England felt a little left out of the party. Now, every grand adventure needs a grand visionary, and for our story, that person was a dashing, ambitious, and frankly, pretty smooth operator named Sir Walter Raleigh. He was more than just a courtier with a fancy beard. He was a close favorite of Queen Elizabeth, a poet, a soldier, and a man with a serious case of wanderlust. Raleigh saw what Spain was doing across the Atlantic and thought, hey, we can do that too, probably better actually. His dream wasn't just about finding gold, though let's be honest, gold was definitely on the shopping list. No, Raleigh had a bigger vision. He wanted to plant a proper English flag, not just a temporary camp, but a real, thriving English community in the New World. A place where English people could live, farm, and build new lives. Think of it as opening a brand new branch office for the British Empire, but this one came with wild forests and, indigenous populations who probably weren't thrilled about new neighbors. So why were people so keen to cross an entire ocean, facing storms, sickness, and the very real chance of becoming fish food? Well, it wasn't just for a change of scenery. First up, money. Always money. England was buzzing with merchants and investors who saw the New World as a giant untapped piggy bank. Imagine forests full of timber, land perfect for growing crops that couldn't grow in England. And yes, the ever-present hope of finding gold and silver mines. It was the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme, or so they hoped. Then there was strategy. Remember that rivalry with Spain? Establishing English colonies in North America wasn't just about economic gain, it was about outflanking Spain. English settlements could act as bases for their ships, allowing them to harass Spanish treasure fleets sailing back to Europe. It was like setting up a secret hideout right on your rival's delivery route. A bit cheeky, but effective. And finally, there was religion. This was a time of huge religious upheaval. England was Protestant, Spain was fiercely Catholic, and everyone thought their way was the only way. For many, colonizing the New World was about spreading the true faith, creating a new society free from the religious squabbles of old Europe. They wanted to build a little piece of English heaven across the waves. Put all those pieces together, the money, the strategy, the religion, and you get the grand, ambitious dream of a new English empire. It wasn't just about sending a few ships. It was about extending England's reach, power, and culture across the Atlantic. Imagine the bragging rights. Oh, you have colonies in South America? That's nice. We have an entire New England over here. This dream, however, was as fragile as a cobweb in a hurricane. The New World wasn't an empty canvas waiting for European paint. It was already home to complex, vibrant indigenous societies, with their own histories, cultures, and territorial claims. And as we'll soon see, The collision of these two worlds would lead to one of history's most baffling and enduring mysteries. So, as Raleigh and his backers buzzed with excitement and plotted their daring voyages, they were about to embark on an adventure that would challenge every notion they had of wealth, power, and survival. They dreamed of prosperity, of glory, of a new beginning. But what awaited them was something far more enigmatic, something that would leave historians scratching their heads for centuries. Close your eyes now. Imagine the salty air, the creak of wooden ships, the distant cries of gulls. Picture England, tiny and ambitious, gazing westwards, towards a vast, untamed continent. The stage is set. The dream is awakened. And the mystery is just beginning to stir. All right, deep breaths now. We've left the bustling courts of Queen Elizabeth and the ambitious dreams of Sir Walter Raleigh behind. We're out on the open sea, heading west. The vast, mysterious Atlantic stretches before us, a true highway to the unknown. But before you send a whole colony packing, bags and all, it's only sensible to send a scouting party, right? Like sending a little drone ahead to check out the new neighborhood before you commit to moving in. And that's exactly what Raleigh did. In 1584, just a year after getting his grand charter from the Queen, basically a royal permission slip to claim any land not already claimed by a Christian prince. Sorry, Spain, too slow. Raleigh launched his first little expedition. This wasn't a full-blown invasion. It was more like a reconnaissance mission. A let's poke around and see what's what kind of trip. Leading this initial voyage were two capable gentlemen, Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow. Now, these weren't your typical swashbuckling pirate types. Amadas was a naval captain, skilled in getting ships across the Big Blue. Barlow was more of a chronicler, a keen observer, and thankfully for us, a pretty good writer. He's the one who gave us most of the juicy details from this trip. Think of him as the embedded journalist of the 16th century, just without the sat phone and flak jacket. They set sail, and after a fairly uneventful but undoubtedly long and boring journey across the open ocean, seriously, imagine weeks with no Wi-Fi, no Netflix, just endless waves and maybe some badly sung sea shanties. They finally sighted land. But not just any land. They found a coast that Barlow, in his later report, would describe with such awe you'd think he'd just stumbled into paradise. Picture this. After weeks of gray ocean, they saw a coastline bursting with green. Lush forests, vibrant vegetation, and the scent of unknown blossoms carried on the wind. Barlow wrote about the sweet-smelling flowers and goodly woods, as if nature itself was putting on a show for their arrival. He even mentioned finding grapes so plentiful that the waves of the sea would wash the grapes on shore, and they grew in such abundance and greatness that they covered every shrub and climbed towards the tops of high cedars. Seriously, imagine stumbling upon a natural vineyard stretching for miles. You'd think you'd found the Garden of Eden, or at least a really great spot for a picnic. The land, they noted, seemed incredibly fertile, perfect for farming. The air was fresh and clear, and there was an abundance of wildlife. Deer, wildfowl, fish. It sounded like a chef's dream. No wonder their reports back to England would sound so enthusiastic. They hadn't found glittering gold, not yet, but they'd found something equally valuable. A seemingly pristine, abundant land ripe for settlement. A land that whispered promises of a prosperous future. But the land wasn't empty. Very soon they encountered the people who already called this place home. These were the indigenous tribes of the region, primarily the Secatan and the Roanoke people. And here's where the story takes on a genuinely interesting and initially quite hopeful turn. Unlike many other first encounters between Europeans and Native Americans, which often started with suspicion and quickly turned violent, the first interactions between Amadas, Barlow, and the local inhabitants were surprisingly peaceful, even friendly. Barlow described how, after a couple of days, a few natives appeared, cautious but curious. One day, a small boat with 3 men came towards them. One of them, a chief's brother named Grangani Mayo, came aboard their ship. Barlow wrote that Grangani Mayo behaved with such a gravity as had not been expected. He was dignified, curious, and importantly, open to trade. The English offered him gifts, shirts, hats, a tin dish. Grangani Mayo, in turn, gave them deer skins and a sort of primitive, large basket made of interwoven reeds filled with fish. This wasn't just a simple swap. It was an exchange of cultures, an attempt to build understanding through shared goods. Through these initial peaceful interactions, 2 particular individuals emerged who would play crucial roles in the Roanoke story, though perhaps not in the ways they first imagined. These were Monteo and Wanchese. Monteo was from the Croatan tribe, a friendly group living on a barrier island, what we now call Hatteras Island. He was intelligent, curious, and quickly seemed to develop a rapport with the English. Wanchese, on the other hand, was from the Roanoke tribe on the mainland. Both men were described as lusty, meaning strong and vigorous. After a period of trade and observation, a truly remarkable thing happened. Monteo and Wanchese agreed to return to England with Amadas and Barlow. Think about that for a moment. These men, from a completely different culture, speaking a completely different language, decided to step onto a foreign ship and sail across a vast, terrifying ocean to a land they knew nothing about. It speaks volumes about their curiosity, their courage, and perhaps their hope that this new connection could be beneficial for their people. For the English, taking Monteo and Wanchese back to England was a stroke of genius. These 2 men could learn English, provide invaluable information about the land, the resources, and the other tribes. They would be living proof, walking, talking advertisements for the New World, demonstrating the gentleness of its people. They were, in essence, the very first cultural exchange students between England and North America, and their stories, as we'll see later, would take very different and very tragic turns. After about 2 months of exploring the sounds and outer banks of what is now North Carolina, Amadas and Barlow decided it was time to head back to England. Their mission had been a success beyond Raleigh's wildest dreams. They hadn't found cities of gold, but they'd found something arguably better: a seemingly peaceful, fertile, and accessible land. Arthur Barlow's written report to Sir Walter Raleigh upon their return was nothing short of a rave review. He painted a picture of a land of incredible natural abundance, a climate that was most wholesome and temperate, and people who were most gentle, loving, and faithful. He described the Native Americans as living in simple harmony with nature, with no signs of the vast, aggressive empires like the Aztecs or Incas that the Spanish had encountered further south. This was exactly what Raleigh wanted to hear. This glowing report, combined with the presence of Monteo and Wanchese, who must have been quite the sensation in Elizabethan London, fueled immense enthusiasm back home. Investors, eager for new opportunities, practically lined up. The idea of a new English colony in America suddenly seemed not just possible, but incredibly promising. It was like a perfectly crafted marketing campaign for a new holiday destination. And so, in honor of the Queen herself, the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I, Raleigh named this newly claimed territory Virginia. It was a clever move. Not only did it flatter the Queen, securing her continued favor and support, but it also clearly staked England's claim to this vast new land. Virginia became a symbol of England's imperial ambitions, a name whispered with excitement in the taverns and parlors of London. It was a statement to Spain, a declaration of intent. We are here, we are coming, and this land is ours. This first voyage, though small in scale, was monumental in its impact. It created the initial spark, the vivid images, and the powerful narrative that would propel Raleigh's grander colonization efforts forward. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated discovery, filled with awe and optimism. For a brief, shining moment, the future seemed bright, full of promise. The relationship with the native peoples seemed amicable, the land abundant, the potential limitless. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet hum of possibility before the great winds of hardship and mystery began to blow. The dream had been sketched out, alluring and vivid. Now it was time to try and build it. Rest easy tonight, knowing that for a fleeting moment in history, the New World seemed to offer only beauty and friendship. The deeper, more complex story, the one that leads to true mystery, is yet to unfold. All right, settle back in. The sweet smells and friendly faces from our last chapter are about to get a bit complicated. Remember those glowing reports from Amadas and Barlow? The ones that made Virginia sound like the best vacation spot ever? Well, it turns out paradise can have a pretty sharp learning curve, especially when you're trying to build a new life in a wild, unfamiliar land, hundreds of miles from home. The enthusiasm back in England was through the roof after that first scouting trip. Sir Walter Raleigh, brimming with confidence, decided it was time for a much bigger, much more serious attempt at colonization. This wasn't just a quick look-see. This was meant to be the real deal, the first significant English attempt to set up shop permanently in the New World. So, in 1585, a fleet of 7 ships set sail, carrying around 108 men. Notice I said men, not many families yet. This was less a cozy neighborhood and more a military outpost. The big boss of the fleet, the admiral, was Sir Richard Grenville. Now Grenville was a brave and experienced sailor. A bit hot-headed perhaps, but definitely not one to back down from a challenge. Think of him as the gruff but capable captain. Once they got to the New World, the day-to-day running of the colony fell to a man named Ralph Lane. Lane was a soldier, a governor. His job was to build and manage the settlement. He wasn't really there to make friends and influence people. He was there to establish a foothold, build defenses, and start looking for valuable resources. He was the on-site manager, if you will, but with swords and muskets instead of spreadsheets. They landed on Roanoke Island, right where the scouts had been. The plan was to create a permanent settlement, a base from which to explore the mainland, find those elusive riches, and maybe even find a better, deeper harbor for ships. They set about building a fort and houses, turning the dream of Virginia into actual wooden structures. Sounds simple enough, right? Except, well, it rarely is. Imagine you've just moved to a new country. You don't know the language, the food is weird, and the local wildlife includes things you've never seen before. Now imagine that, but without Amazon Prime, no immediate doctors, and the nearest grocery store is a 3-month boat ride away. That was life for Ralph Lane's colonists. They faced immense challenges. First, the unfamiliar environment. They were used to neat, tidy English fields and forests. Here, it was wild, dense, and full of unknown plants and animals. Building homes from scratch, clearing land, and figuring out what to plant and when. It was a massive undertaking. Then there was the lack of infrastructure. No roads, no established farms, no towns. Everything had to be built from the ground up, literally. They weren't just settlers. They were carpenters, farmers, soldiers, all rolled into one, often without the right tools or enough experience. And perhaps the biggest hurdle, dependence on supplies from England. They hadn't brought enough provisions to last them long term. They expected more supply ships to arrive regularly, but as we learned in Chapter 1, sailing across the Atlantic was no walk in the park. Ships got delayed, or worse, lost. This meant they quickly started relying on the local indigenous tribes for food, especially corn. And while borrowing a cup of sugar from your neighbor is fine, demanding corn from people who need it for their own survival is a recipe for trouble. They were, in essence, trying to survive on a shoestring budget in a wild, untamed land, hoping a supply delivery would show up eventually. It was a risky game of wait and see. Remember Mateo and Juan Chesi, our exchange students from the first trip? They had gone back to England and returned with this 1585 expedition. Mateo, from the Croatan, remained friendly. Juan Chesi, however, after seeing England and probably realizing the sheer power and numbers of the English, grew much more suspicious and hostile. He understood better than anyone that these weren't just curious visitors. They were here to stay, and that meant taking land and resources. This growing suspicion was a huge problem. The initial good vibes from 1584 quickly started to sour. Ralph Lane, as a soldier, tended to be more authoritarian. He needed food for his men, and he wasn't afraid to demand it. The Native Americans, while initially helpful, weren't about to be walked all over. There were many small incidents that chipped away at trust. One of the most famous, and frankly ridiculous, was the incident of the stolen silver cup. One of the English colonists believed that a local chief's village had stolen a silver cup. Now, whether it was actually stolen or just misplaced, or maybe picked up by a curious child, we don't know. But Lane, instead of trying to smooth things over, overreacted massively. He went to the village, demanded the cup back, and when it wasn't immediately produced, he ordered his men to burn the village and destroy their cornfields. Think about that. Burning a village and destroying food supplies over a silver cup. It was a completely disproportionate response, a shocking act of aggression that showed the Native Americans just how little the English respected their homes or their means of survival. This kind of arrogance and violence was a huge mistake. It didn't win friends, it created enemies. The tension kept building, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. The chief of the Roanoke people, the dominant tribe in the area, was named Wingina. He had initially been friendly, welcoming the English, even trading with them. But after incidents like the Silver Cup, and seeing the English's insatiable demands and military might, Wingina grew increasingly wary. He started to see the English not as temporary guests, but as a genuine threat to his people's land and way of life. He began organizing other local tribes, planning a coordinated attack to drive the English out. Ralph Lane, being a soldier, eventually got wind of Wingina's plans. Instead of trying to de-escalate or negotiate, he decided to strike first. On June 1st, 1586, Lane invited Wingina and several of his high-ranking warriors to a parley, a meeting for discussion, supposedly to iron things out. But it was a trap. As soon as the Native American leaders arrived, Lane's men attacked. Wingina was killed. This was a brutal, shocking act of betrayal. It wasn't just another skirmish. It was the calculated assassination of a tribal leader under a flag of truce. This event cemented the hostility between the English colonists and many of the surrounding tribes. Any hope of peaceful coexistence, of learning from each other, and building a shared future pretty much went up in smoke with Wingina's death. From this point on, the colony was living in a state of high alert, surrounded by increasingly hostile neighbors. It was a very lonely position to be in. As the colony teetered on the brink of disaster, running low on supplies, facing constant threat, and utterly isolated, fate intervened in the most unexpected way. The legendary English privateer and explorer Sir Francis Drake suddenly appeared off the coast of Roanoke. Drake wasn't there for them. He had just finished a hugely successful raiding campaign against Spanish settlements in the Caribbean and Florida. Basically, he'd been pirating on a grand scale for Queen and country, and he was heading home, loaded with treasure. His appearance was completely by chance, a happy coincidence for the beleaguered colonists. When Drake saw the desperate state of Lane's colony, he offered them help. He initially offered to give them supplies and a small ship so they could continue their mission. But by this point, the men were utterly demoralized. They were tired, hungry, and terrified of the hostile tribes. They just wanted to go home. So they begged Drake to take them back to England. Drake, being a pragmatic man, agreed. And so the entire colony, around 100 men, packed up what little they had and boarded Drake's ships, abandoning the first fort they had so painstakingly built. As they sailed away, a supply ship sent by Raleigh finally arrived, only to find the colony completely deserted. And just a little while after that, Sir Richard Grenville himself arrived with more supplies and men, also to find no one there. Frustrated, Grenville left a small contingent of 15 men to maintain England's claim to the island, promising to return. But those 15 men would be quickly forgotten, becoming the first casualties of this new, harsh land. This first major attempt at an English colony in the New World ended not with a bang, but with a hurried retreat. It was a stark lesson in the brutal realities of colonization. The dream of paradise, which began with such optimism, had quickly shattered against the rocks of misunderstanding, arrogance, and violence. The seeds of conflict had been sown, the trust broken. The fragility of those early dreams became painfully clear. As you drift off tonight, think about how quickly paradise can turn into a struggle, how easily good intentions can unravel. The first hints of trouble in this supposed Eden have now become undeniable, and the greatest mystery of all is yet to come. Settle down, take a deep breath. We've just navigated through a pretty rough patch, haven't we? The last chapter ended with a bit of a fizzle, not a bang. The grand dream of an English foothold in the New World seemed to be, well, falling apart. Ralph Lane's military-style colony went home with their tails between their legs, and that small group of 15 men left behind by Grenville. They probably didn't have the cheeriest time. It looked like the whole Virginia project might just crumble. But here's the thing about big dreamers like Sir Walter Raleigh. They don't give up easily, especially not when their reputation, their queen's favor, and a whole lot of their own money are on the line. Most people, after 2 failed attempts, might just throw in the towel, mutter something about bad luck, and go back to knitting or whatever rich people did in the 16th century. But not Raleigh. He was like that dog with a bone. Once he got an idea in his head, he wasn't letting go. Despite the clear setbacks and the undeniable failure of the 1585 colony, Raleigh remained absolutely, stubbornly determined. He wasn't blind to what went wrong. He knew that Ralph Lane's military approach, The reliance on supplies and the escalating conflicts with the Native Americans were major issues. He knew that simply trying to set up a fort wasn't enough to build a lasting presence. It was like trying to build a house with just a hammer. You needed more tools, a better plan. His reputation was on the line. He had promised the Queen a new English territory, a jewel in her crown. He had invested a fortune of his own money. We're talking serious cash, the kind that would buy you multiple castles today. To abandon the project now would be a massive personal and financial blow. Plus, the Spanish were still out there, gloating. Raleigh wasn't about to let that happen. He saw the potential, the vastness of the land, the strategic importance, and he wasn't going to let a few hiccups stop him. He just needed a better plan. And so, Raleigh decided to completely change his approach. This wasn't going to be another military garrison, a bunch of grumpy soldiers squabbling over silver cups and burning villages. Oh no, this was going to be different. This was going to be a true, permanent, family-oriented agricultural settlement. He wasn't sending adventurers. He was sending colonists, people ready to put down roots, build homes, and cultivate the land. The idea was to create a self-sufficient community, not one constantly looking over its shoulder for the next supply ship. They would farm their own food, raise livestock, and eventually produce goods that could be sent back to England. Think of it as building a little English village, transplanted whole into the American wilderness. This vision was much more peaceful, much more sustainable. It was about creating a new society, not just a military outpost. He called it the City of Raleigh, a grand name for what he hoped would be a grand beginning. It sounds a bit like an early real estate development, doesn't it? Come live in the fabulous City of Raleigh, free land with every purchase. For this new, more peaceful venture, Raleigh needed a different kind of leader. Not a hardened soldier like Lane, but someone with a calmer temperament. Someone who understood the land and perhaps, crucially, understood people. He chose John White. Now, John White wasn't a stranger to the New World. He had actually been on that ill-fated 1585 expedition with Ralph Lane. But White wasn't a soldier. He was an artist, and a brilliant one at that. During his first trip, he spent his time meticulously sketching the landscapes, the plants, the animals, and most importantly, the indigenous people of the region. His watercolors are, to this day, some of the most precious historical records we have of Native American life before extensive European contact. They show incredibly detailed portraits of chiefs, warriors, women, and children going about their daily lives. He truly saw them, which was rare for Europeans at the time. Choosing an artist as governor might seem a bit odd. Would you hire your art teacher to run a city? Probably not. But Raleigh saw something in White. He was observant, perhaps more empathetic, and he clearly had a deep appreciation for the land itself. He understood the potential. Plus, he had already built a rapport with some of the Native Americans, including Manteo. Raleigh hoped White's calmer, more diplomatic approach would smooth over the very rough edges left by Lane's aggressive tactics. White was tasked with a colossal job: to make peace, to build a city, and to keep everyone alive. No pressure. To convince people to pack up their entire lives and sail across the terrifying ocean to a place where the last group pretty much ran away, you needed more than just a good sales pitch. You needed serious incentives. Raleigh knew this, so he made some very attractive promises to anyone willing to join the City of Raleigh. First, there were land grants. Imagine hundreds of acres of fertile land, free for the taking. For many commoners in crowded England who would never own a sliver of land, this was an incredibly powerful lure. It was a chance to own property, to build generational wealth, to finally be masters of their own destiny. Second, and perhaps even more revolutionary, was the promise of self-governance. The colonists weren't just going to be subjects. They would have their own town council, make their own laws, and run their own affairs within certain limits. This was a radical idea for the time. It offered a level of freedom and autonomy that was unheard of in England. It was a chance to build a society based on their own rules, a sort of early American experiment in democracy. These were powerful motivators, promising not just a new life, but a better, freer life. This commitment to self-governance and permanent settlement meant Raleigh needed a very different kind of colonist. This wasn't a ship full of soldiers and adventurers ready to fight and then go home. This was a ship, in fact, several ships, carrying around 117 people. And for the first time in an English attempt in the New World, it included families, women, and children. Think about that for a moment. Instead of grizzled soldiers, picture mothers, fathers, young couples, and small children boarding those ships. This wasn't a military expedition. It was an emigration. These were people committing to a new life, building homes, planting gardens, raising families. They brought their hopes, their fears, their cooking pots, and probably their favorite teddy bears, if they had teddy bears back then. Among them was John White's own married daughter, Eleanor Dare, who was pregnant. Her husband, Ananias Dare, was also part of the group. This was a true attempt at establishing a new society, a living, breathing community that would grow and thrive. This wasn't a temporary camp. It was a hopeful, ambitious step towards forging a new English nation across the sea. They were brave, perhaps a little naive, but full of the dream of a new beginning. So, as these ships set sail in the spring of 1587, carrying families and all their worldly possessions, there was a fresh wave of optimism. This time it felt different. This was a real commitment, a true beacon of hope shining across the vast ocean. The dreams weren't just of gold and glory, but of hearth and home, of children playing in the sun, of harvests gathered from fertile soil. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let your mind wander to those brave souls. Imagine the quiet hopes of those families, venturing into the absolute unknown, carrying the fragile seeds of a new society. They were sailing not just for land, but for a promise of a better life, a true home in a wild new world. They didn't know it then, but they were about to become part of one of history's greatest and most heartbreaking mysteries. The birth of this new hope was also the prelude to a most profound silence. All right, settle in deep. Pull that blanket a little tighter. We've talked about the dreams, the grand plans, the promise of a fresh start in the city of Raleigh. But as anyone who's ever tried to build a sandcastle knows, between the idea and the actual building, there's a whole lot of hard work, and sometimes a rogue wave or two. In this case, the rogue wave was the entire Atlantic Ocean. It was the spring of 1587. Imagine the scene at the docks in England. Not just a handful of tough soldiers, but families. Mothers holding toddlers, fathers with worried lines on their faces, older children wide-eyed with a mix of fear and adventure. They were boarding 3 ships, the chief vessel, called a flyboat, and 2 smaller pinnaces, 3 little wooden specks about to face one of the biggest, most unpredictable things on Earth. It was an act of immense bravery, or perhaps a touch of optimistic madness. The voyage across the Atlantic was no pleasure cruise. Forget about buffets and deck chairs. This was a brutal, grueling, and frankly terrifying ordeal that lasted for months. Imagine being crammed into a space no bigger than a small house, with over 100 other people, all of you smelling faintly of sweat, stale food, and unwashed wool. Personal space was a concept for landlubbers. You slept where you could, probably on a hard deck, swaying violently with every wave. The ships were small, at the mercy of the elements. Storms weren't just an inconvenience, they were life or death situations. The wooden timbers would groan and creak like a haunted house. Waves, taller than the masts, would crash over the decks, threatening to swallow the entire vessel. You'd be soaked to the bone, shivering, probably seasick to your stomach, and wondering if this was the day the ocean decided to claim you. There was no weather app to check, no satellite navigation, just the stars, a compass, and a whole lot of prayer. Food would have been scarce and monotonous. Hardtack, a biscuit so tough you could probably use it as a weapon. Salted meat that tasted suspiciously like old leather, and water that quickly went stale or worse, got slimy. Sickness spread like wildfire in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, fevers, scurvy, that nasty disease caused by lack of vitamin C, which made your teeth fall out and your gums bleed. These were constant companions on the journey. People died at sea, their bodies committed to the deep, adding to the grim reality of the adventure. Through all this, there was a mix of fear and anticipation. The fear was raw and immediate. The storm, the sickness, the unknown. But the anticipation, that persistent little spark, was what kept them going. The promise of land, the dream of a new life, the thought of seeing trees and solid ground again. Every day was a fight for survival, a test of endurance, pushing these brave souls to their very limits. Now, every ship needs a good navigator, someone who knows their way around the constellations and currents. For this voyage, the chief pilot and master of the lead ship was a man named Simon Fernandez. And if this story were a play, Fernandez would be the villain you love to hate. He was a Portuguese navigator, highly skilled, but with a notoriously shady past, including a reputation for piracy. He was a man with his own agenda, and it didn't seem to line up with Governor John White's. From the moment they set sail, Fernandez was a royal pain in White's side. White had explicit instructions from Sir Walter Raleigh to drop off the colonists at Chesapeake Bay. This was important. Chesapeake Bay was known to have a much better harbor, deeper waters, and a more favorable environment for a large, permanent settlement. It was the preferred location. Raleigh had even given White letters and gifts to deliver to the 15 men left on Roanoke Island from the previous expedition, with instructions for them to then join the main colony at Chesapeake. But Fernandez had other ideas. Throughout the voyage, he was openly rebellious and disobeyed White's commands. He insisted on taking a detour to raid some Spanish ships, a little side hustle piracy, just for old time's sake. White protested, but as governor, his authority at sea was limited, especially when the captain of the ship was pulling the strings. Then came the real betrayal. When they finally reached the Outer Banks of North Carolina, Fernandez, without any good reason and against White's direct orders, refused to sail further north to Chesapeake Bay. He claimed it was too late in the season, that the weather was turning, and that they risked running aground. He even went so far as to dump some of the passengers' personal belongings ashore, essentially forcing them off the main ship. This was a massive problem. Roanoke Island, while beautiful, lacked a deep water harbor suitable for large ships. It was also, as we know from the previous chapter, the site of the hostile encounter with Chief Wingana and his people, and the abandoned fort. It was not the planned, safer, more strategic location. Why did Fernandez do this? Historians still debate it. Was he simply impatient and eager to get back to privateering? Was he secretly working for someone else? Or did he just genuinely dislike white and enjoy causing trouble? Whatever his reasons, his actions were suspicious, incredibly damaging, and directly put the entire colony in a precarious position. From day one, he basically dropped them off at the wrong bus stop in a potentially dangerous part of town, and then sped off. Not exactly a five-star navigator, if you ask me. So, thanks to Fernandez, on July 22nd, 1587, the ships finally dropped anchor, not at the planned Chesapeake Bay, but off the familiar yet unsettling shores of Roanoke Island. The colonists, exhausted and likely a bit green from the voyage, finally stepped onto solid ground. But instead of a welcoming party or a prepared settlement, they found silence. They walked towards where the 1585 fort had stood, hoping to find those 15 men Grenville had left behind. What they discovered was grim. The fort was abandoned, not just empty but overgrown with melon and pumpkin vines, like nature had quickly swallowed it back up. There were signs of prior struggle, of a hasty departure, or worse. The houses that Ralph Lane's men had built were still there, but in ruins. There were human bones scattered around, stark reminders of what had perhaps happened to those 15 men. It was a chilling discovery. The optimistic mood of setting foot in a new world was immediately dampened by the ghosts of the previous failures. Instead of starting fresh, they were starting amidst the wreckage of a previous attempt, with a haunting question hanging in the humid air. What happened here? You can almost feel the shift in atmosphere, can't you? That initial sense of awe and excitement, that quiet hope from Chapter 4, began to curdle into a feeling of unease, even dread. The moment they saw those ruined buildings and scattered bones, a chill must have run through the entire group. This wasn't the fresh start they were promised. This was a place with a past of conflict, abandonment, and disappearance. The very air seemed to hum with the echoes of the previous failed attempt. Every rustle in the leaves, every distant bird call, might have felt like a warning. They were meant to build a new city of Raleigh, a beacon of English civilization, but instead they found themselves on an island that felt more like a tombstone for forgotten dreams. They were meant to start in Chesapeake Bay, a safe, deep-water harbor. Instead, they were marooned on a barrier island, exposed, vulnerable, and surrounded by tribes who had recently been antagonized by their English predecessors. It was as if the universe was subtly telling them, "You're in the wrong place, at the wrong time." The calm before the storm of the first voyage had been misleading. The storm had already passed over this island, leaving only silence in its wake. And now, this new group, with their families and their hopes, was stepping directly into that unsettling quiet. Close your eyes now. Feel the gentle, yet relentless rocking of a ship at sea. Imagine the cramped darkness below deck, the whisper of fear mixed with the stubborn flame of hope. Then picture the sudden silence of a deserted shore, the wind whistling through ruined walls, and the unsettling sight of bones where home should have been. This was their arrival, not with fanfare, but with a lingering question. The dream of a new life had reached its destination, But the destination itself held a secret, and as they set about trying to salvage what they could from the ruins, unaware of the agonizing wait ahead, they were already caught in the currents of a mystery that would stretch across centuries, making them truly the lost colonists. All right, settle back. The unsettling silence of the last chapter is about to be filled, not with dread, but with the sounds of hard work and, for a brief, precious time, the murmur of hope. Remember those crumbling structures and scattered bones? Not exactly a welcoming committee, were they? But these colonists, these brave souls who had crossed an ocean, weren't about to give up that easily. They had promises of land, of freedom, of a new life, and they were ready to fight for it, not with swords, but with shovels and hammers. Governor John White, an artist by nature but a leader by necessity, knew they couldn't just stand there staring at the ruins. They had mouths to feed, homes to build, and a massive amount of fear to overcome. So, they rolled up their sleeves, dusted off their hopes, and got to work. Their immediate tasks upon arrival were nothing short of monumental. Imagine moving into a house that's been abandoned for 2 years, where half the walls are down, the roof is caved in, and wild plants are growing in the living room. That's pretty much what they faced. First up, repairing structures. The surviving buildings from the 1585 expedition were in a sorry state. They had to clear out the overgrowth, patch up walls, and reinforce foundations. This wasn't just about making a shelter. It was about reclaiming the space, turning a ghost town into a potential home. They pulled down some of the old, decaying parts and salvaged whatever usable timber they could find. Next, and even more crucial for their long-term survival, building new homes. With over 100 people, they needed proper housing, not just makeshift shelters. This meant felling trees, shaping timber, and constructing cabins. The rhythmic thud of axes, the clang of hammers, the sawing of wood. These were the new sounds on Roanoke Island. It was the sound of effort, of perseverance, of a community slowly, painstakingly taking shape. And while they were building, they also had to think about food. Immediately. They couldn't survive indefinitely on whatever they'd brought across the ocean. So, they started planting crops. They cleared land, tilled the soil, and sowed seeds. Corn, beans, squash. The staples that the Native Americans had taught previous explorers were vital for survival in this land. It was a race against time, hoping for a good harvest before their dwindling supplies ran out. Every sprout that pushed through the earth was a tiny victory, a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, they could make this wild place their home. It was like building a giant, very complicated Lego set, but with real trees and hungry bellies as motivators. Amidst all this hard physical labor, something truly extraordinary happened, a moment that cast a bright, hopeful light over the struggling colony. Just a few weeks after their arrival on August 18, 1587, Governor John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to a baby girl. This wasn't just any birth. This was the first English child born in the New World. And they named her Virginia Dare. Think about the significance of that moment. In a place filled with uncertainty, where every day was a struggle, where the ghosts of past failures whispered in the wind, this tiny, brand new life was a powerful symbol of hope and permanence. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about legacy. It meant that this place wasn't just a temporary camp. It was a place where families could grow, where children could be born, where generations could live and thrive. Virginia Dare's birth must have filled the colonists with renewed purpose. She was the embodiment of their dream, a living, breathing testament to the idea that this could be a New England, a true home. It's easy to forget, amidst the later mystery, the sheer joy and monumental importance of that tiny baby in that fledgling settlement. She was the innocent face of their grand experiment, a beacon against the wilderness. While some were building and farming, Governor White was trying to fix a much trickier problem: the fractured relationship with the local indigenous tribes. Remember how Ralph Lane's men had burned villages and murdered Chief Wingina? Yeah, that left a pretty sour taste, understandably. White knew that peaceful relations were crucial for the colony's survival. They needed food, knowledge of the land, and allies against potentially hostile groups. He tried to re-establish friendly relations, especially with the Croatan people who lived on a nearby island. This was Monteo's tribe, and Monteo himself was proving invaluable as an intermediary, a translator, and a bridge between two vastly different cultures. However, the memory of past aggressions lingered, and rightly so. Many tribes, particularly those on the mainland, like Wingina's former people, were deeply suspicious or openly hostile. They wanted nothing to do with these English newcomers. There were incidents of skirmishes, and one of the smaller groups, led by White's assistant, was ambushed by Native Americans, resulting in the death of one of the colonists. This was a stark reminder of the danger, a constant shadow hanging over their ambitious project. White sent envoys, tried to explain their peaceful intentions, and used Monteo to bridge the communication gap. But it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a watering can. The previous conflicts had burned deep scars, and trust was incredibly hard to regain. It was a tightrope walk for White, trying to build goodwill while also ensuring his colony's safety. In a significant gesture of his commitment to the English, and perhaps a symbol of hope for better relations, Monteo, our Croatan friend and guide, agreed to be baptized into the Christian faith. This momentous event took place on August 13, 1587, just 5 days before Virginia Dare's birth. He was given the English title of Lord of Roanoke and Dasamongaponke, an attempt by the English to acknowledge his status and formally incorporate him into their system, even if it meant little to his own people. Monteo's baptism was a powerful act. For the English, it was seen as a victory, a sign that they could civilize and integrate the Native Americans. For Monteo, it might have been a strategic move, an attempt to solidify his position as a key intermediary, someone who could truly speak for both sides. He genuinely seemed to want peace and understanding between his people and the English. His role as an intermediary was vital. He understood both cultures, spoke both languages, or was quickly learning English, and had earned a degree of trust from both sides. He was the vital link in White's efforts to navigate the treacherous diplomatic waters. Monteo stood at the crossroads of two worlds, trying to build a bridge across a vast cultural chasm. He was truly a fascinating and pivotal figure in this story, a man caught between his ancestral loyalty and the compelling new presence of the English. So, as the summer of 1587 wore on, Roanoke Island was alive with activity. The rhythmic sounds of construction, the steady hum of effort, and yes, the tiny cries and eventually the soft laughter of baby Virginia Dare. It was a period filled with a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet hope that against all odds they could succeed. They were literally building a new future, brick by brick, or rather, log by log. As you drift off tonight, Let those hopeful sounds fill your mind. The purposeful thud of a hammer, the gentle murmur of voices, the soft gurgle of a baby's contented sleep. This was the quiet hope of a new home taking shape, a testament to the enduring human desire to build, to create, to find a place where dreams can take root. But remember, even the most hopeful beginnings can sometimes lead to the most profound and unsettling silence. Settle in. The happy sounds of construction and baby giggles from our last chapter are about to fade into something much quieter, much more unsettling. Because even with all that hard work and new hope, reality, as it often does, eventually knocked on the door. And in the wilds of Roanoke, reality was a harsh, uninvited guest. Remember how Raleigh's grand plan for the city of Raleigh was a self-sufficient agricultural settlement? Well, that sounds great on paper. But turning a wild, overgrown island into a thriving farm and village from scratch, with limited tools and no local supermarket, is a Herculean task. These weren't seasoned farmers fresh from English fields. Many were craftsmen, merchants, or simply city folk. They were learning as they went, and the learning curve was steep, very steep. It didn't take long for the colonists to realize they were in deep, deep trouble when it came to their supplies. Despite all their efforts to plant crops, the reality was that they couldn't possibly grow enough food to sustain themselves for the coming winter. Not so quickly, anyway. It was like trying to bake a 5-course meal when you only have half a bag of flour and a single egg. You're going to be hungry. Their initial provisions, the food and tools they'd brought across the ocean, were dwindling fast. Remember, the voyage itself had been long and hard, burning through resources. They were ill-equipped for long-term self-sufficiency in this brand new environment. They lacked certain vital tools, seeds that were suitable for the local soil, and critically, enough experienced farmers to pull off a miracle harvest. Think about it. They were trying to build houses, clear land, learn new farming techniques, and deal with increasingly hostile native tribes, all at the same time. It was an overwhelming situation. As the weeks turned into a couple of months, the grim truth became undeniable. They were facing immediate shortages. They weren't just low on sugar or tea. They were staring down the barrel of serious hunger and a lack of essential equipment needed to survive a harsh winter in an unfamiliar land. The dream of self-sufficiency felt a million miles away, replaced by the very real fear of starvation and exposure. As the days shortened and the chill of approaching autumn crept into the air, the colonists grew increasingly desperate. Their initial enthusiasm had given way to a gnawing fear for their survival. They looked at their dwindling food stores, the unyielding wilderness, and the shadows of hostile Native Americans, and they knew they couldn't go on much longer without help. They needed more than just a resupply. They needed more people, more skilled laborers, more resources, and a renewed connection to their home country. They held urgent discussions, probably long, worried talks around flickering campfires, and after much debate, they came to a stark, terrifying conclusion. Someone had to go back to England. Someone had to make the perilous journey, explain their dire situation, and bring back the vital supplies and reinforcements they so desperately needed. And who better to go than their governor, John White? He was their leader, the one with direct access to Sir Walter Raleigh, the one who could best articulate their needs and persuade the English investors. So, the colonists, fearing for their very lives, implored him, practically begged him, to return to England. "Go, Governor," they must have said. "Go for our sake, for the future of this colony, for Virginia Dare." It was a desperate plea, a Hail Mary pass in a game they were rapidly losing. Imagine the personal agony of John White in that moment. On one hand, he was the governor, responsible for the lives of over 100 people. He knew he was probably the only one who could make a difference, the only one who could get Raleigh to send help. On the other hand, he was a father and a grandfather. His married daughter, Eleanor Dare, was there, and his precious granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the very symbol of their hope, was just a few weeks old. Leaving them behind, sailing away into the vast uncertainty of the ocean, knowing they were facing such danger, must have torn him apart. He had seen the harsh realities of the New World, the difficulties of travel, the unpredictability of both nature and human plans. He knew the immense risks involved in leaving, and the even greater risks if he failed to return quickly. It was a choice between his duty as a leader and his love as a family man, and it was perhaps the hardest decision he ever had to make. He didn't want to go. Not really. He wanted to stay and protect his family, to help build the colony with his own hands. But the colonists were insistent. They pointed out that if anyone could get Raleigh to act, it was him. And so, with a heavy heart and likely a lump in his throat, he finally agreed. But he made a solemn, heartfelt promise. He would return swiftly. He would cross the ocean, gather the supplies, and be back on Roanoke Island as fast as humanly possible. He would not abandon them. It was a promise made under the direst of circumstances, a vow that would haunt him for years to come. And so, in late August of 1587, the ships prepared to depart. It was an emotional farewell, filled with tearful goodbyes and whispered hopes. The colonists gathered on the shore, watching as John White boarded one of the pinnaces, ready to brave the Atlantic once more. Imagine the scene: the small boats pushing off from the shore, the distant waving of hands, the final lingering glances. White himself recorded in his journal the sorrowful parting from his daughter and granddaughter. Every face on that ship, and every face on the shore, knew the immense stakes. This wasn't just a goodbye, it was a desperate gamble. As the ships sailed away, getting smaller and smaller on the horizon, the colonists stood there, watching until they vanished from sight. That last glimpse of the departing ships was also, tragically, the last glimpse any European would have of the Roanoke colonists. They didn't know it then, of course. They just hoped and prayed for a swift return. They expected John White to be back within a few months, maybe half a year at most, laden with supplies and reinforcements. But the ocean and the world had other plans. Close your eyes now. Feel the silence that falls after a loved one departs, leaving you alone with your thoughts and your fears. Imagine the soft lapping of the waves against the shore, a sound that quickly turns from comforting to unsettling. The hope of a new beginning was still there, but now it was wrapped in a chilling layer of growing unease. The long wait for return had begun, a wait that would stretch far beyond anyone's imagination, transforming a desperate plea for help into one of history's most profound and enduring mysteries. The promise was made, the journey began, and the curtain began to fall on the city of Raleigh, leaving only questions behind. Settle back. The last time we saw Governor John White, he was sailing away from Roanoke Island, promising his family and his entire colony that he'd be back soon. He was heading for England, desperate to gather supplies and reinforcements for his struggling settlement. He imagined a quick turnaround, perhaps a few months, and then back across the Atlantic, a hero with ships full of provisions. Oh, how wrong he was. Because when John White stepped ashore in England, he didn't just walk into a quiet country preparing ships. He walked straight into a nation on the brink of total war. The world, it turned out, had other, much grander, much more terrifying plans than helping a small, struggling colony in a distant land. John White's journey back across the Atlantic was probably just as rough as the journey out, but his mind would have been consumed by a different kind of storm. Urgency. Every mile, every wave, every day that passed meant more hardship for his daughter, his granddaughter, and the over 100 souls he'd left behind. He arrived in England, probably looking haggard and desperate, and immediately threw himself into the monumental task of getting help. He raced to London, to the court of Queen Elizabeth, to Sir Walter Raleigh, to anyone who would listen. He poured out the story of their struggles, the dwindling supplies, the need for immediate relief. He painted vivid pictures of the challenges, probably showing Raleigh his meticulous drawings of the land and its people to remind him what was at stake. He needed ships, he needed men, he needed food, tools, everything. He was a man on a mission, fueled by the love for his family and the immense responsibility he carried. He pleaded, he argued, he surely begged. He was absolutely frantic in his efforts to gather support and resources. But the response he received wasn't the immediate, enthusiastic action he desperately hoped for. Instead, he was met with grave faces, worried whispers, and the chilling news that England itself was facing an existential threat. While White was enduring the harsh Atlantic across the English Channel, an enormous, terrifying shadow was gathering. This was the Spanish Armada, King Philip II of Spain's ultimate weapon. Remember our two chess players, England and Spain? Well, Philip was tired of playing nice. He was fed up with Queen Elizabeth, with her Protestant religion, with her constant support of rebels against Spain, and especially with her privateers like Sir Francis Drake, who kept raiding his treasure ships. He'd had enough. Philip decided to launch a full-scale invasion of England to conquer the country, overthrow Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism. And he put together a fleet so immense, so powerful, that it was considered invincible. Imagine this, 130 ships. That's not just a few boats, that's a floating city. These weren't little fishing boats either. We're talking massive galleons, towering warships bristling with cannons. On board were roughly 30,000 men, soldiers, sailors, priests, everything needed for an invasion. It was the largest naval fleet the world had ever seen at that time. England's preparations for war were intense, almost frantic. Every able-bodied man was called up. Beacons were built along the coast, ready to be lit to warn of invasion. English shipyards worked day and night, rushing to build and arm their own fleet, which, while smaller and more agile, was nowhere near as large as the Armada. Sir Francis Drake, Lord Howard of Effingham, and other famed commanders were preparing their ships, drilling their crews, and strategizing how to defend their homeland against this gargantuan threat. The entire country was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. The air crackled with tension, like a thundercloud about to burst. When an entire nation is preparing for an invasion by the greatest naval power on Earth, pretty much everything else grinds to a halt. This was certainly true for shipping. With the Spanish Armada bearing down on them, Queen Elizabeth's government issued a strict embargo on all English shipping. What does that mean? It means literally no ships could leave England. Every single ship, big or small, fast or slow, was needed for the war effort. Merchant ships were converted into fighting vessels or used for transport. Sailors once employed in trade were conscripted into the Navy. Every available resource, every spare ounce of gunpowder, every piece of rope, it all went towards defending England. It was an all-hands-on-deck situation, and if you weren't directly helping fight the Spanish, you were effectively told to wait your turn. For John White, this was a crippling blow. He had arrived in England hoping for a speedy return, but suddenly, the entire country was focused on a battle for its very existence. There were no ships to spare for a distant colony. There were no sailors to spare. There was no attention, no money, no resources available for anything other than the immediate threat. He was trying to shout about his colony's desperate plight over the roar of a gathering storm that threatened to engulf all of England. His urgent pleas about Roanoke must have sounded like a whisper against the deafening clamor of war preparations. This embargo, this complete national lockdown on shipping, meant John White's mission turned into an agonizing, soul-crushing waiting game. He was stuck. He couldn't charter a ship. He couldn't find a crew. He couldn't even get official permission to leave. He was trapped in England, watching helplessly as the weeks, then months, ticked by. His desperation must have been immense. Every day that passed meant his daughter and granddaughter were closer to starvation, closer to danger. He knew the colony was not well supplied. He knew the indigenous tribes could turn on them at any moment. He knew the winter was approaching. He tried everything. He appealed to Raleigh. He tried to charter private vessels, offering vast sums of money. At one point, he managed to secure 2 small ships, barely seaworthy, and tried to set sail. But even those attempts were thwarted, either by bad weather forcing them back, or by eager English privateers who, perhaps confusing them for Spanish ships, or simply eager for plunder, attacked and robbed them, forcing them to turn back to port. It was one setback after another, a cruel joke played by fate. He was so close, yet so agonizingly far. His heart must have ached with every passing day, every sunrise, knowing that Roanoke was still waiting, still hoping, and he was stuck, helpless. The promise he had made to his family to return swiftly felt like a bitter, impossible dream. Finally, in August of 1588, the long-anticipated clash happened. The Spanish Armada, that supposedly invincible fleet, sailed into the English Channel. What followed was a series of intense, dramatic naval battles. The smaller, faster, and more maneuverable English ships, aided by daring tactics and ultimately by violent storms, often called the Protestant wind by the English, managed to repel the Spanish. The defeat of the Armada was a monumental victory for England. It was a turning point in history, establishing England as a formidable naval power and protecting its independence. There was immense celebration across the country, a huge sigh of relief. But this victory came at an immense cost. The war had drained England's treasury. It had taken all its ships, all its resources, and all its attention for months. Even after the Armada was defeated, the threat of further Spanish aggression lingered. England was exhausted, financially strapped, and still very much on a war footing. The immediate danger was over, but the lingering effects of such a massive conflict meant that Raleigh's colonization efforts and John White's desperate pleas were still pushed to the very bottom of the priority list. The world was no longer on hold, but it was still reeling from the shock, trying to pick up the pieces. Close your eyes now. Feel the tension of an impending battle, the silent dread before the storm breaks. Imagine the distant, muffled sounds of war drums, the anxious waiting for news, good or bad. For John White, This was more than just a national crisis. It was a personal torment. Every day the war raged. Every ship that was diverted, every delay was a nail in the coffin of his colony's hopes. The world had stopped for England's survival, and in that agonizing pause, a small colony in the distant New World was slowly, silently, being forgotten. The promise of a swift return faded into the cruel reality of a war-torn nation. The silence on Roanoke Island was deepening, becoming heavy with unanswered questions, and the lost colonists were becoming truly lost. Settle back in. We've been through the grand dreams, the harsh realities, and the crushing delays caused by a world at war. Governor John White is stuck in England, tearing his hair out, desperate to get back to his colony. But what about the colonists themselves? What about his daughter, Eleanor, and baby Virginia Dare, left behind on that island in the wilderness? They knew the risks. They knew the journey to England and back was long and dangerous. But before White left, they made a solemn agreement, a pact. It was a simple plan, born out of desperate hope, a way to communicate across vast distances and an uncertain future. Think of it as leaving a note for your friend if you have to duck out early from a meeting. Only this note had to survive storms, wild animals, and the passage of time. When John White was preparing to leave Roanoke Island, facing that agonizing separation from his family and his people, he and the colonists talked. They planned for every contingency they could imagine. What if they had to move? What if they couldn't wait for his return in the same spot? They needed a way to tell him where they'd gone. So they agreed upon a very specific, very clear signal. If, for any reason, the colonists found it necessary to leave Roanoke Island and move to a new location, they were to carve the name of their new destination into a prominent tree, or a large post, or something equally noticeable within the abandoned settlement. Imagine them discussing this, perhaps around a flickering campfire. If we go, where will we go? How will the governor know? And then, a hand pointing to a sturdy tree. We'll carve it right here, plain as day. No fancy writing, just the name, so he knows where to follow. It was simple, direct, and seemed foolproof in its design. They weren't just leaving a forwarding address. They were leaving a promise, a breadcrumb trail for White to follow. But they also had to plan for the worst-case scenario. What if they weren't just moving because they'd found a better spot, or because it was safer somewhere else? What if they were forced to leave because of danger? What if they were attacked, or ravaged by disease, or simply overwhelmed by starvation and had to flee in distress? For that chilling possibility, they devised a second, even more crucial part of the signal. If they were forced to leave due to distress or attack, if they were in trouble, they were to carve a cross above the name of their new location. Think of the weight of that little symbol. A simple cross carved above a name. It wasn't just a religious symbol, it was a desperate plea for help, a warning. It meant, we left, but not willingly. We left in fear. Come find us, but be prepared for what you might find. This was the alarm bell, the red flag that would tell White. Something went terribly wrong here. It was a silent cry for help, left for someone who might not see it for months or even years. This distinction was absolutely vital. A name carved alone meant, we're okay, just moved here. A name with a cross meant, we were in danger, we had to run, and we need help desperately. The difference between a simple move and a forced flight was literally a single mark, a carved cross. It was a small detail, but one that would become immensely important. So, why go through all this trouble? Why carve messages into trees? because this symbol, this carefully agreed upon system, was meant to be nothing less than a beacon of hope. It was a message across time and distance, a thread connecting them to John White and to England. For the colonists, leaving such a message was an act of faith. It meant they believed White would return. It meant they believed they could survive long enough to move or to endure distress and still leave a coherent message. It was a lifeline thrown out into the vast uncertainty, a quiet assurance that they wouldn't simply vanish without a trace. It was their way of saying, "We'll wait for you. We'll tell you where we are. Just come back." For John White, this symbol was everything. It was the key to finding his family, the path back to his colony. It meant that even if he returned to an empty Roanoke Island, he wouldn't be completely lost. He would have a direction, a clue, a starting point for his search. It was a way to manage the agonizing uncertainty of his mission, a promise that he wouldn't return to total silence. This symbol was their shared secret, their quiet understanding, a promise that reverberated across the vast ocean. The importance of this agreement, the weight of the promise contained within those simple instructions, cannot be overstated. For John White, his swift return to England was not just about fulfilling a duty, it was about honoring this sacred pact. He knew that the colonists' potential survival hinged on his ability to return, and their ability to leave this specific message. If they moved, and he found the name, he would know where to go. If he found the name with a cross, he would know they were in dire straits and needed rescue. If he found nothing, well, that was the terrifying thought they dared not dwell on. This agreement, sealed in the fading light before White's departure, became the very cornerstone of their hopes. It was the last link between two groups of people, separated by an ocean, and the looming threat of war. It was a quiet commitment, made under the vast, indifferent sky of the New World. A silent prayer that when the time came, the message would be clear, and the return would not be in vain. The lives of everyone on Roanoke Island depended on that promise, on that simple word, or word with a cross, carved into a tree. No pressure on the person wielding the carving knife, right? Just the fate of a whole colony. Close your eyes now. Imagine the colonists gathered around John White, listening intently as he explained the signal. Picture the quiet understanding in their eyes, the silent promise made in the fading light as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with colors that mirrored their hopes and fears. Feel the solemnity of that moment, the immense responsibility that lay on everyone's shoulders. A simple word, a small mark, holding the key to a mystery centuries in the making. The promise was given, the symbol was agreed upon, and as the ship carrying White sailed further and further away, the colonists were left to face their uncertain future, hoping that when the time came, their message would be found and understood. The silence was beginning to settle, but this symbol was meant to pierce through it. Settle in, deep into your covers. Feel the quiet around you. Because tonight, we're returning to Roanoke Island. Not in the hopeful light of a new beginning, but in the anxious shadow of a long, agonizing wait. Remember Governor John White, stuck in England, tearing his hair out while the Spanish Armada loomed? Well, the Armada was defeated. England breathed a sigh of relief. But for White, the personal torment was far from over. Years passed, not months, but 3 long, agonizing years. 3 years where every day must have felt like a century. 3 years where he desperately fought to find a way back, constantly thwarted by a war-torn England that had little time or money for a distant colony. Imagine the nightmares he must have had, the chilling thoughts of his daughter, Eleanor, and his precious granddaughter, Virginia Dare, facing the wilderness alone. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, in 1590, John White caught a break. He wasn't given a grand fleet of rescue ships by Raleigh or the Queen. No, he hitched a ride. He managed to secure passage on a privateering expedition, a group of English ships heading to the Caribbean to raid Spanish settlements, which planned to stop at Roanoke on their way back to England. It wasn't ideal. These privateers weren't interested in a slow, thorough search. They wanted plunder, but it was his only chance. The sense of urgency and dread on that voyage must have been immense. Every mile they sailed, White's heart must have pounded with a terrible mixture of hope and bone-chilling fear. What would he find? Would they be there? Would they be safe? Or would he find only silence and the grim evidence of what the wilderness, or worse, had done? He had kept his promise, but had he been too late? The weight of those 3 lost years pressed down on him with every creak of the ship's timbers. As the ships finally neared the Outer Banks, the tension must have been almost unbearable. The crew of the privateers, focused on potential Spanish prizes, probably saw it as just another stop. But for John White, this was the moment of truth. He peered through the mist in the breaking dawn, straining his eyes for any sign of life, any wisp of smoke, any sign of his colony. Hope, that stubborn little flicker, must have battled fiercely with a cold, creeping fear. Maybe they were there, waiting, safe. Maybe he would hear familiar voices. Or maybe the silence that had lingered in his mind for 3 years would be confirmed. They anchored offshore, too dangerous for the larger ships to get close to the shallow shoals. White, along with some of the crew, boarded smaller boats to row to the island. Every stroke of the oar, every dip of the paddle, brought him closer to the answer he craved and dreaded. As they approached the shore, the first thing they noticed was the absolute silence. Not the silence of a sleeping camp, but the deep, unsettling silence of absence. There was no sign of life, no smoke from a fire, no voices, no movement in the trees. It was utterly, profoundly deserted. They landed and made their way through the overgrown path to where the settlement had been. What they found was truly eerie. The fort and houses they had painstakingly built 3 years earlier were gone. Not just dilapidated, but gone. The palisade, the protective fence around the settlement, had been carefully taken down. Some of the heavier cannon were still there, half buried in the sand. But everything else, the homes, the workshops, the tools, all the signs of daily life, had vanished. Nature had begun to reclaim the site. Vines and wild plants were growing rampant, swallowing the last traces of human habitation. It was as if the colonists had simply evaporated into the humid air, leaving no trace behind but the slow, silent work of the wilderness. It was a ghost town, not just abandoned, but almost completely erased. It was a chilling sight, far worse than finding a ruined fort, because it hinted at a deliberate, organized departure. But to where? White's heart must have sunk. The worst fears were confirmed. They were gone. But then, as he searched desperately, he remembered the plan, the signal, the promise. His eyes scanned the large trees and posts, and there it was, carved into one of the principal posts of the fort, not directly on a tree, but on a gate post where they would have entered the settlement, was a single word, clearly carved in large letters, Croatoan. Relief, a wave of profound, overwhelming relief must have washed over White. Croatoan. It was the name of Manteo's friendly tribe, who lived on a nearby island, what we now call Hatteras Island. This was it. This was the answer. They had moved to Croatoan Island, seeking refuge with their allies. But then, as he searched further, the relief was quickly replaced by a cold dread. He looked for the cross, the crucial distress signal. If they had left in fear under attack, they were to carve a cross above the name. He searched the post. He searched nearby trees. He searched everywhere. And there was no cross. No cross. That single missing symbol changed everything. It meant, according to their agreement, that the move was planned, not forced by distress. It implied they had left of their own free will, perhaps seeking a better, safer location with their allies. But if it was a planned move, why such a complete erasure of their settlement? Why no other note, no hidden message, no indication of their fate? The presence of Croatoan was a clue, but the absence of the cross was a haunting question, one that would echo through the centuries. It was the ultimate cliffhanger, carved into wood. As if the Croatoan clue wasn't baffling enough, White made another unsettling discovery. Before he left 3 years prior, he had buried several large chests containing his personal belongings, including many of his precious drawings, some valuable books, and perhaps even some letters or journals. He'd carefully buried them, hoping to retrieve them upon his return. Now, he found the spot. But the chests were gone, or rather, they had been dug up, broken open, and their contents scattered and spoiled. Some of his books and drawings were still salvageable, but many were damaged or missing. This indicated that someone, or something, had deliberately ransacked his buried possessions. Was it Native Americans? If so, were they friendly or hostile? If they were the Croatan, why would they disturb White's personal belongings? Or was it another group, perhaps hostile tribes who had attacked after the colonists left? This was a further layer of mystery, suggesting a chaotic departure or a later intrusion. It hinted at violence, or at least a disregard for private property that didn't quite fit with the peaceful Croatoan message. It was a small detail, but one that added to the deep, unsettling feeling of the entire discovery. Close your eyes now. Feel the creeping silence of an empty home, the cold dread of realizing something precious is truly lost. Imagine the wind whispering through deserted trees, carrying questions that have no answers. John White had returned, but not to the reunion he had longed for. He returned to a profound, ghostly silence, broken only by a single word carved in wood, and the chilling absence of a cross. The mystery of Roanoke had truly begun. The stage was set, not for a joyful homecoming, but for an endless puzzle. And as the ships prepared to leave the desolate island once more, the questions lingered, whispered on the wind, destined to haunt historians for centuries to come. Settle back in. Take a moment to imagine that scene from our last chapter. Governor John White standing on Roanoke Island, a lone figure amidst the ghostly silence, staring at a single word carved into a weathered post. Croatoan. It was the only tangible clue he found. No people, no bustling settlement, just that one mysterious message. It's the kind of thing that makes your heart pound even centuries later, isn't it? But for White, in that exact moment, that word wasn't just a riddle, it was a lifeline. It was the only answer he had, and he immediately began to decipher its meaning based on the agreement he'd made with the colonists 3 years prior. Remember the crucial detail of their pre-departure pact? If the colonists had moved due to distress or attack, they were to carve a cross above the name of their new location. White searched. He desperately scanned the post, the nearby trees, the entire vicinity of the abandoned fort. He must have looked with hawk-like intensity, his heart in his throat. And what did he find? The word Croatoan was there, plain as day, but the cross was nowhere to be seen, not a single mark. For John White, this was an immediate, overwhelming wave of relief, profound, soul-deep relief. The absence of the cross was everything. It meant that his family, his granddaughter Virginia Dare, and the rest of the colonists had not been forced to leave under duress. They hadn't been attacked and massacred right there. They hadn't fled in terror, leaving a warning. Instead, the lack of the cross suggested a planned move, a deliberate decision to relocate, perhaps because of dwindling resources, or perhaps to join a friendly native tribe. This interpretation, while not providing a complete answer, was a massive comfort. It meant they were alive. They had simply moved. It was like finding a note that says, "Gone to the beach, be back later," instead of "Help, trapped under a giant coconut." It immediately steered White's fears away from immediate disaster and towards a hopeful direction for a search. So, if it was a planned move, where had they gone? The answer was right there in the carved word, Croatoan. This wasn't just a random word. White knew exactly what it meant. Croatan was the name of a specific island, what we now know as Hatteras Island, located just south of Roanoke Island. And even more importantly, Croatan was the home of Monteo's people. Remember Monteo? Our friendly Native American intermediary, the one who had traveled to England, who had been baptized, and who had consistently shown goodwill towards the English. White had developed a strong rapport with him. He knew Monteo's tribe, the Croatan, were peaceful, reliable, and generally friendly towards the English. If the colonists were to seek refuge or integrate with any Native American group, the Croatan would be the most logical and safest choice. It was the most obvious answer, a comforting thought that they had gone to stay with people known to be allies. The focus of White's search immediately shifted to Croatan Island. It was a tangible destination, a place where he truly believed he would find his family, perhaps living amongst Monteo's people, awaiting his return. He almost certainly imagined a joyful reunion, perhaps with Virginia Dare, now a toddler, running to greet him. The clue seemed to point clearly, definitively to one place. With the Croatoan clue firmly in hand, White was more determined than ever to reach Croatan Island. It was just a short sail away, right? A mere hop, skip, and a jump from Roanoke. He felt tantalizingly close to the answers, to his family. But as we've seen throughout this saga, the universe had a cruel sense of timing. Just as he was ready to sail to Croatan Island, everything seemed to conspire against him. The weather, which had been relatively calm, suddenly turned violent. A massive storm brewed, making the treacherous shallow waters around the Outer Banks even more dangerous. The winds howled, the waves rose, and the ships were buffeted mercilessly. During this worsening weather, to make matters worse, the ships began to lose their anchors. First one, then another. Anchors were incredibly vital for a ship's stability and safety, especially in rough seas and shallow waters where you couldn't afford to drift. Losing them was a serious maritime emergency. And then there were the impatient crew members. Remember, White had only hitched a ride with privateers. These weren't dedicated rescue missions. They were profit-driven adventurers. They were losing valuable time, risking their ships, and getting increasingly frustrated with the delays. They had other targets, other Spanish ships to raid, and they weren't about to hang around indefinitely while White looked for his missing colony. They were probably grumbling, saying things like, "Come on, Governor, we've got gold to find. Your family can wait." Though I imagine they used stronger language than that. These three factors, the terrible weather, the critical loss of anchors, and the crew's extreme impatience, combined to create an insurmountable barrier. The captains of the privateering ships flatly refused to continue the journey to Croatan Island. It was simply too dangerous, too costly, and too time-consuming for their mission. White pleaded, he argued. He surely offered money, but to no avail. The decision was final. The ships, now critically low on supplies and anchors, had to turn back towards England, leaving the mystery unsolved. Imagine the utter, soul-crushing frustration of John White in that moment. He had the clue, the crucial, tantalizing clue that pointed directly to his family's whereabouts. He was just a short sail away. He could almost taste the reunion, but he was powerless. His desperate pleas were ignored, overridden by the harsh realities of naval priorities and the relentless forces of nature. He was like a detective who finds a bloody glove, knows exactly who it belongs to, but then the police chief says, "Sorry, can't pursue it. Too much traffic." He had the answer, or at least the direction to it, but he was utterly unable to follow up. The clarity of the Croatoan carving was immediately clouded by the inability to act on it. This inability to immediately follow up is one of the most tragic ironies of the Roanoke mystery. If White had been on a dedicated rescue mission, if he had ships under his own command, perhaps history would have unfolded very differently. But he was a passenger, at the mercy of others' agendas, and his hopes were dashed against the rocks of circumstance. The clue was there, solid and compelling, but the missing pieces of the puzzle remained out of reach. Close your eyes now. Feel your mind grappling with incomplete information, the way a puzzle piece almost fits, but doesn't quite. Imagine those lingering question marks hovering in the air, just beyond your grasp. White had his clue, but he couldn't use it. He had hope, but it was snatched away by a storm and an impatient crew. And so, the greatest puzzle in American history remained precisely that, a puzzle. The Croatoan hypothesis became the leading theory, a tantalizing whisper of survival and integration. But without John White being able to make that final short journey, it remained just that, a hypothesis. The silence deepened, but now it was a silence full of unresolved questions, echoing down through the centuries, waiting for an answer that may never come. Settle back in. We've explored the hopes, the struggles, and the devastating mystery of John White's return to a silent, empty island. He found that single, tantalizing clue, Croatoan, but was tragically unable to follow up on it. So what happened? What could have possibly become of those 117 men, women, and children? This is where the detective work truly begins, centuries later. Historians, archaeologists, and curious minds have spent hundreds of years trying to solve this riddle. Over time, various theories have emerged, some wild and fanciful, others grounded in historical accounts and logical deduction. But the one that has held the most weight, the one that offers perhaps the most comforting explanation for the lost colony, is the idea of assimilation and integration. The leading idea, the one that most historians lean towards, is that the Roanoke colonists didn't vanish into thin air, nor did they all perish from starvation or attack. Instead, the theory goes, they made a strategic, desperate choice. They packed up what they could and assimilated into friendly indigenous tribes. And the most likely candidates for this merger were, you guessed it, the Croatan people. Why the Croatan? Well, they were already known to be friendly. Monteo, our helpful intermediary, was from the Croatan. John White himself had good relations with them. In the face of dwindling supplies, hostile neighbors, and an uncertain future, seeking refuge with the Croatan, who knew how to live off the land and had already shown kindness, would have been the most logical, most sensible survival strategy. It's like being lost in a strange country and finding someone who speaks your language and offers you a warm meal. You'd take it, wouldn't you? This theory suggests that the colonists weren't wiped out. They simply moved in with their neighbors. They learned new ways of life, adapted to the customs of the Native Americans, and over time, their English identities slowly blended into the fabric of the indigenous communities. Now, you might be thinking, that's a nice theory, but where's the proof? And while definitive, smoking gun proof remains elusive, there are several intriguing pieces of evidence and accounts that lend strong support to this idea, gathered from various sources years and even decades after White's last visit. First, there are later reports from English explorers who ventured into the region in the early 1600s, including those from the Jamestown colony. They heard stories from various Native American tribes about white Indians or people with beards living among certain tribes, particularly those to the south of where Roanoke was located. For example, Captain John Smith, the famous leader of Jamestown, was told by Chief Powhatan, who was not always reliable but still worth noting, of a group of white people living west of their lands who dressed and lived like Native Americans. Then there are whispers from Spanish spies. Remember, Spain was keenly interested in what the English were doing in the New World. Spanish intelligence reports from the early 1600s also mentioned rumors of fair-skinned people living among various tribes in the Carolina region. They were perhaps looking for signs of an English foothold, but their findings, though secondhand, supported the idea that some Europeans might have survived and integrated. And perhaps most compelling, there are indigenous oral traditions. Many Native American tribes in the Carolina region, particularly the Lumbee and the Tuscarora, have long held traditions and stories of European ancestors joining their tribes. These stories often speak of individuals with lighter skin, different hair colors, and even specific surnames that appear in the Roanoke colonists list, who were absorbed into their communities centuries ago. While oral traditions can change over time, their persistence and consistency across generations are powerful. It's like your family having a story about your great-great-great-grandparent coming from a far-off land. There's usually a grain of truth in those tales. From a purely practical standpoint, assimilation makes a lot of sense. Think about the desperate situation the colonists were in. They were short on food, running out of tools, and probably facing a looming winter. They were in an unfamiliar environment, surrounded by resources they didn't fully understand how to utilize. And let's not forget the increasing hostility from some of the mainland tribes. In such a dire situation, seeking help and ultimately merging with a more established society, a society that already knew how to thrive in that land, was not just logical, it was a pure survival instinct. The Native Americans knew the land, knew how to hunt, fish, farm, and forage. They knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous. They knew how to build shelters suited for the local climate. They were the experts. For the colonists, integrating would have meant access to food, shelter, protection, and invaluable knowledge. It would have been a trade-off. they'd give up their English ways, their language, perhaps even some of their beliefs, to gain the essential knowledge and community needed to survive. It was less about being rescued in the traditional sense, and more about adapting to survive, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They weren't just giving up, they were transforming. Fast forward to the 21st century, and modern science is also starting to weigh in on this fascinating theory. While no definitive smoking gun has been found, recent DNA studies and archaeological finds have added intriguing layers to the assimilation hypothesis. For instance, some DNA research has explored the possibility of European markers appearing in the genetic makeup of certain Native American groups in the region, consistent with the idea of intermarriage and mingling. While these studies are complex and often require more data, they offer a tantalizing glimpse into possible genetic connections that span centuries. Furthermore, archaeological digs at sites on Hatteras Island, Croatan, and inland areas have unearthed artifacts that show a blend of European and Native American influences. We're talking things like English pottery shards mixed with traditional Native American tools, or even European-style buttons found alongside indigenous artifacts. These mixed material culture sites suggest that there was indeed contact and possibly cohabitation between the two groups. It's like finding a 16th century English teacup in the middle of a Native American village site. It tells a story of interaction that goes beyond simple trade. While these findings aren't conclusive proof that all the lost colonists assimilated, they certainly suggest that some form of mingling occurred, lending significant weight to the idea that some of them survived by becoming part of the indigenous fabric of the land. Close your eyes now. Imagine the comforting thought of finding community when you are utterly lost, the warmth of being adopted into a new family, even one very different from your own. This theory of assimilation, while still leaving many details unknown, offers a sense of peaceful resolution. It suggests that the lost colonists weren't just lost. Perhaps they found a new way to live, adapting to a new world. It's a story of survival, of blending cultures, of a desperate hope that found its answer in an unexpected embrace. As you drift off to sleep, let the thought of that possible communion bring a quiet peace. A new family found, not in England, but in the heart of a wild, ancient land. Settle in now, pull that blanket a little tighter. We just explored the more hopeful possibility for the lost colony, that they found safety and a new life by joining friendly Native American tribes. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? A soft landing in a harsh world. But history, much like life, rarely offers such simple, neat endings. For every comforting whisper, there's often a chilling echo. And when it comes to the Roanoke Mystery, that chilling echo speaks of conflict, violence, and a darker fate. So let's bravely, carefully consider the less optimistic possibilities, the ones that suggest the colonists faced not adoption, but annihilation. One of the most persistent, and certainly the most grim, theories is that the Roanoke colonists were not welcomed into a new community, but were instead attacked and massacred by hostile indigenous tribes. Specifically, many historical accounts point a finger at the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, a formidable group led by the legendary Chief Powhatan, whose territory stretched across much of what is now Virginia, north of Roanoke. This theory suggests that the Croatoan message might have been a ruse, or perhaps left by only a few survivors who hoped to mislead potential pursuers, or simply never had the chance to add the cross of distress. It posits that the entire venture came to a violent, bloody end, a brutal lesson in the dangers of encroaching on already claimed lands. It's the kind of story that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, imagining the terror and desperation. Where does this theory come from? Much of its early weight comes from the famous English adventurer, Captain John Smith, the leader of the Jamestown Colony, which was established in Virginia in 1607, about 2 decades after Roanoke disappeared. Smith, known for his dramatic flair and sometimes exaggerated tales, had a complicated relationship with Chief Powhatan. He was captured by Powhatan's warriors, famously, and perhaps romantically, saved by Pocahontas, though that part is debated. And during his captivity, he claimed to have heard chilling stories directly from Powhatan himself. According to Smith, Chief Powhatan boasted of having annihilated the Roanoke colonists. Powhatan supposedly claimed his warriors had attacked the English settlement, slaughtering them because they had been living in his territory without permission, or because they had stirred up trouble with some of his subject tribes. He allegedly showed Smith some English iron tools and weapons that he claimed were taken from the dead colonists. Now, it's important to remember that Powhatan was a shrewd political operator. He might have been trying to intimidate Smith, sending a clear message: "Don't mess with me, or your colony will suffer the same fate." And Smith himself wasn't above embellishing a good story. So, while Smith's account is a significant piece of evidence, it has to be viewed through the lens of political maneuvering and possible exaggeration. It's like hearing a boast from a powerful rival. You can't be sure it's 100% true, but it definitely gets your attention. To understand why Powhatan might have acted in such a way, or at least claimed to, we need to look at the historical context of his power. The Powhatan Confederacy was a growing, formidable force in the region. Chief Powhatan was actively expanding his territory, subjugating smaller tribes, and consolidating his power. He was a strategic leader, and he saw any outsiders, especially armed Europeans, as a potential threat to his burgeoning empire. The previous English colony, Ralph Lane's expedition, had already created a deep sense of suspicion of outsiders through their aggressive actions, like the burning of a village over a silver cup and the assassination of Chief Wingana. Even though John White tried to make peace, the damage was already done. The reputation of the English preceded them, a reputation for taking what they wanted and dealing harshly with anyone who resisted. It's entirely plausible that the Roanoke colonists, even if they had moved away from the coast, eventually ran afoul of Powhatan's expanding influence. Whether they were seen as trespassers, rivals for resources, or simply an opportunity to demonstrate Powhatan's power to his own people and other tribes, conflict would have been a very real, very dangerous possibility. They were in someone else's backyard, and that someone else was a powerful chief who didn't tolerate threats. Beyond outright violence, there are other, quieter, yet equally devastating possibilities. What if the colonists simply succumbed to the relentless pressures of their environment? The possibility that the colony simply succumbed to illness and lack of food is always present when discussing early colonial ventures. Life in the New World was incredibly harsh. The Europeans had no immunity to many of the local diseases, and the Native Americans had no immunity to European diseases. Even a common cold could be deadly. Sickness could decimate a population quickly, leaving too few healthy individuals to care for the sick or to gather food. And then there's the constant gnawing threat of starvation. As we know, the colonists weren't well equipped for long-term self-sufficiency. They were relying on their newly planted crops, which might have failed, or on trade with Native Americans. which could dry up due to hostility or resource scarcity. If a disease outbreak hit during a period of low food supplies, it would create a deadly spiral. People weakened by hunger are more susceptible to illness, and a sick population can't hunt or farm effectively. It's a vicious cycle that could wipe out a small, isolated community without a single sword being drawn. Adding to these woes were the environmental factors that were completely beyond the colonists' control. This wasn't always a paradise, despite Barlow's initial glowing reports. Early English records, and even modern scientific studies, suggest that the region experienced severe droughts during the late 1580s and early 1590s. A drought would devastate crops, make hunting more difficult, and drastically reduce available drinking water. Even the most skilled farmers would struggle against a prolonged period of no rain. And then there were the harsh winters. While the Outer Banks might seem mild today, 16th century winters, especially without proper shelter and heating, could be brutal. Blizzards, freezing temperatures, and strong coastal storms could easily cut off a small, isolated settlement from resources and from any hope of rescue. Exposure, frostbite, and the inability to hunt or fish in extreme weather would quickly lead to suffering and death. So, it's possible that the Roanoke colonists simply withered away, victims of a combination of disease, starvation, and an unforgiving environment. The land itself, not necessarily hostile tribes, simply proved too powerful, too overwhelming for them to conquer. They might have slowly faded away one by one, leaving no one left to carve a full story, or even a cross on that gatepost. Close your eyes now. Feel the chilling whisper of danger carried on the wind, the cold dread of realizing your vulnerability in a strange, unforgiving land. Imagine the fear of hunger, of sickness, of enemies unseen. This theory, while unsettling, reminds us of the brutal realities faced by early colonists and the immense power of both human conflict and nature's indifference. The questions linger. Did they find a new home, or did they meet a tragic end? The theories pull us in different directions, leaving us to ponder the various fates that could have befallen those brave, desperate souls. And as you drift off to sleep, let the whispers of the past remind you of the fine line between hope and despair in the wilderness. Settle back in. We've explored the most prominent theories about the lost colony, the comforting idea of assimilation with friendly tribes, and the chilling possibility of conflict and starvation. But the Roanoke mystery, like a complex knot, has many loose ends. And as with any great historical puzzle, there are always other ideas, other whispers, some more plausible than others, that linger in the shadows. So, let's consider some of these less common, yet equally intriguing possibilities. Perhaps they didn't go to the Croatan, and perhaps they weren't wiped out by a rival tribe. What if their fate was shaped by the relentless sea, a cunning enemy, or something even stranger? Imagine the colonists' growing desperation on Roanoke Island. Supplies dwindling, hostile tribes lurking, no sign of John White's return for years. What if, after months or even a couple of years of waiting, they simply decided they couldn't wait any longer? What if, in a final, desperate gamble for survival, they attempted to sail away from Roanoke Island, hoping to find another English ship, or even to try and make it back to England? It's a chilling thought. Could they have built or repaired a small vessel, perhaps one of the pinnaces left by White, or even constructed a crude, larger boat, and set off into the vast, unforgiving ocean? The risks would have been astronomical. They were not experienced sailors for such a long voyage, especially not with women and children. The Outer Banks are notorious for treacherous shoals and sudden violent storms. The theory suggests that they may have attempted to relocate to a better, safer spot along the coast, maybe even tried to meet up with a known shipping lane, and were simply lost in a storm. Their makeshift vessel could have capsized or been swamped, sending all 117 souls to the bottom of the Atlantic. No distress signal needed, no cross carved, just a swift, silent end beneath the waves. The ocean, after all, is a hungry beast, and it often swallows its victims whole, leaving no trace. It's a very plausible outcome for anyone venturing into those waters unprepared. Now let's revisit that big ongoing chess game between England and Spain. Remember how the Spanish Armada was a massive distraction? Well, even with the Armada defeated, Spain remained England's sworn enemy, and Spain had a deep-seated fear of English colonization in North America. They saw any English presence as a direct threat to their vast, gold-rich American empire and their shipping lanes. The long-held fear of Spanish attacks on English settlements was very real. Spanish officials in Florida and the Caribbean were well aware of English attempts to establish colonies further north. They regularly sent out reconnaissance missions, patrols, and even small expeditions to find and eliminate any English presence they discovered. For them, it was a matter of national security and economic protection. There's historical evidence of Spanish efforts to find Roanoke. Spanish ships did indeed search the Carolina coast in the years following the 1587 colony's disappearance. They found abandoned English forts and sometimes captured English sailors whom they interrogated about the Roanoke settlement. While they never reported finding the actual colonists, their constant patrolling and aggressive stance make a Spanish attack, or at least a disruption, a possible factor in the colony's demise or relocation. What if a Spanish patrol discovered the colonists, either attacked them directly or forced them to flee deep into the interior, scattering them? It's a theory that fits the tense political climate of the time, and it adds another layer of human conflict to the mystery. And then, for those who love a good ghost story, there are the more fantastical tales, the ones that venture beyond historical credibility and into the realm of folklore and legend. Throughout history, when faced with an inexplicable disappearance, human imagination tends to fill the void with the extraordinary. We're talking about supernatural explanations, tales of curses, of vengeful spirits, of the land itself rejecting the European invaders. Some local legends over the centuries have hinted at the colonists being taken by mysterious forces, vanishing into another dimension, or even being transformed into trees or animals by ancient magic. These are the kinds of stories that get passed down around campfires, designed to send shivers down your spine. Of course, from a historical standpoint, these explanations aren't considered credible. There's no evidence, no logical support for them beyond the power of human imagination trying to cope with the utterly unknown. But for the purposes of atmosphere, and to acknowledge the enduring human need to find any explanation for the truly baffling, it's worth a brief, chilling whisper. The lost colony has, after all, become America's first great ghost story. A tale that begs for an answer, even a magical one. What makes the Roanoke mystery so utterly persistent, so frustratingly enduring, is the lack of definitive trace. Think about it. If 117 people simply vanished, where are the bodies? If they were attacked and massacred, why is there a lack of mass graves or clear battle sites? Archaeologists have searched for decades, but no large burial sites or battlegrounds littered with English weapons and skeletal remains have ever been conclusively found on Roanoke Island or the immediate surrounding areas. If they built a major settlement, why is there so little physical evidence of it today? Why no clear signs of struggle? No remnants of a desperate last stand? This absence of concrete evidence is precisely why the mystery remains. It's what keeps all these theories alive, because none of them can be definitively proven or disproven by a conclusive discovery. It's a silence that speaks volumes and yet tells us nothing. It's like looking at a blank page and being told it contains the answer to everything. Close your eyes now. Feel the vastness of the ocean, stretching endlessly into the unknown. Imagine the hidden dangers that lurk, the secrets that the deep waters keep. And ponder the great, persistent unknown that surrounds the fate of the lost colony. Did they vanish into the waves, or were they swept away by a hidden enemy? Or did something else, something beyond our current understanding, claim them? The story of Roanoke reminds us that even with clues, even with tireless searching, some questions remain stubbornly unanswered, leaving us to wonder, to imagine, and to be forever captivated by the whispers of history's most profound vanishing act. Settle in, for one last time. We've journeyed through the dreams, the struggles, the hopes, and the chilling silence of the Roanoke Colony. We've seen the bravery of those who dared to cross an ocean, the personal anguish of John White, and the tantalizing yet frustrating clues they left behind. Now, as the night deepens, let's ponder why this particular story, this profound vanishing act, continues to hold such a powerful grip on our imaginations, centuries after the fact. The Roanoke Colony is more than just a historical footnote. It's America's first great unsolved mystery, a puzzle whispered from generation to generation. It's truly become America's first ghost story. The story of Roanoke didn't just disappear with the colonists. It immediately entered American folklore and collective memory. From the earliest days of English settlement in the New World, the tale of the lost colony was told and retold. It became a cautionary tale, a spooky campfire story, and a symbol of the immense dangers and unknowns that lurked in the vast American wilderness. Imagine early settlers in Jamestown, perhaps years later, sitting around a fire, trading stories. Someone would inevitably bring up Roanoke. Did you hear what happened to those folks on that island? Just vanished. Poof. It became an almost mythical event, a true-life enigma that haunted the fringes of their new world. It was a reminder that despite all their courage and ingenuity, nature and the unknown could still swallow you whole. Over time, this tale grew. Plays were written, books were penned, and the mystery became ingrained in the American consciousness. It was the original X-Files episode, before there were even files. It made people wonder, it made them search, and it kept the memory of those lost souls alive. It wasn't just a historical event. It became a cultural touchstone, a warning etched into the very foundation of colonial aspirations. Why does this particular mystery continue to captivate us centuries later? Why not other lost ships or vanished expeditions? There's a profound power in the unknown that Roanoke embodies so perfectly. It's the ultimate cliffhanger, frozen in time. Think about it. No bodies. Unlike a battle or a shipwreck where bodies might wash ashore, there's no mass grave, no definitive proof of death. A single ambiguous clue. Croatoan, with no cross. It's a clue that gives just enough information to tantalize, but not enough to solve. It hints at survival, but without confirmation. It's the perfect unresolved chord, the human element. It's not just a ship that disappeared, it's families, it's children, it's baby Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, whose fate is utterly unknown. This personal connection makes the mystery infinitely more poignant and relatable. The early American context. It happened at the very dawn of English America, at a time when the continent was still largely uncharted by Europeans. It was the ultimate frontier mystery. These elements combined to create a perfect storm of fascination. Our brains crave resolution, and Roanoke offers none. It invites speculation, encourages imagination, and constantly reminds us that some questions simply defy easy answers. It's a puzzle with missing pieces, and our human nature compels us to try and find them, even if we never will. Even today, with all our modern technology and scientific advancements, the search for definitive answers continues. The mystery of Roanoke isn't confined to dusty old books. It's an active area of ongoing research and archaeology. There's the Croatoan Project, for example, where archaeologists continue to excavate sites on Hatteras Island, the historical Croatoan island, looking for evidence of European presence mingling with Native American artifacts. Every shard of pottery, every broken tool found, could potentially offer a new piece of the puzzle, a whisper from the past. Then there are the more controversial attempts, like the so-called Dare stones. These are a series of engraved stones discovered in the 20th century, claiming to be messages from Eleanor Dare, Virginia's mother, describing the colony's tragic fate. While they captured public imagination for a time, serious historians and archaeologists have largely disputed their authenticity, finding them to be elaborate hoaxes. It's a reminder that in the hunt for clues, sometimes the desire for an answer can lead to false paths. But even the existence of such hoaxes speaks to how deeply this mystery has permeated our culture and how desperate people are for a definitive answer. Scientists are also looking at climate data from tree rings to understand the droughts of the era, and even exploring the possibility of DNA evidence from modern-day Native American descendants to find European genetic markers. The search is relentless, driven by that persistent human curiosity to solve the unsolvable. Beyond the historical facts and the intriguing theories, the true tragedy of Roanoke lies in the human element. It's the story of individuals, brave and hopeful, who ventured into the unknown with dreams of a better life. It's the story of their struggle, their quiet perseverance, and ultimately, their disappearance. Especially poignant is the fate of Virginia Dare. Born a beacon of hope, the very first English child in the New World, her life became a symbol of lost potential. What kind of woman would she have become? Would she have bridged two cultures, speaking both English and Algonquian? Would she have been a leader, a pioneer, a symbol of a truly integrated New World? Her unknown fate represents all the possibilities that vanished with the Roanoke colonists. She is the innocent face of this enduring enigma, a child of two worlds, lost to both. Her story, and the story of all the colonists, reminds us of the immense challenges of early colonization, the brutal realities of venturing into unfamiliar lands, and the often terrible cost of empire building. And so, as our journey through the mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke comes to a close, we are left not with a neat, tidy answer, but with a profound sense of wonder and reflection. The Roanoke Colony remains a silent testament to the challenges of early colonization, a haunting question mark in the tapestry of American history. It whispers to us from the past, a story of ambition and survival, of hope and despair, of conflict and connection. It reminds us that some mysteries are meant to endure, to keep us curious, to make us ponder the vastness of the unknown, both in history and in the world around us. The sleep may come now, quiet and deep, but the mystery of Roanoke lingers, a gentle echo in the night, inviting you to wonder and to dream of possibilities, even when the answers remain hidden in the mists of time.